good to see all of you here today. We want to welcome you to our library. And we're come today because, first of all, I'm proud of myself because I'm getting close to pronouncing his name right. We have Mr. Terry Nienaber. How am I doing?
Great.
Mr. Terry Nienaber, and he is an aerospace engineer from the NASA Langley Research Center. And he's here today to provide us with some information. His bio is here in the program, and I'm not going to insult your intelligence and read it to you. You can read it for yourself. So I'm just here to welcome you and to present to you Mr. Terry Nienaber.
I appreciate that. So I've been chatting with people leading in, so I hope I don't repeat myself too much. But so I'm an engineer. I work at NASA Langley in Hampton. A lot of people to make. It's like, well, the space shuttle was. This is NASA. The space shuttle was about that. It was the most visible of what we do, but it was certainly not everything we do. Why did we get rid of the space shuttle? The space shuttle served a really interesting phase of our space development. It was designed in the 60s and 70s, built in the and commissioned in late 70s, early 80s. It was getting old. It was expensive to maintain, and we decided that NASA had explored low Earth long enough to let commercial entities start to come in and do some of the exploration and operations in space, and we were going to look beyond low Earth. And so we've been developing technologies within NASA directly to go beyond low Earth orbit.
How many miles is it from Earth to outer space?
I don't know what the definition is technically. I mean, you're just talking semantics there, right? What do they define as outer space versus inner space versus... I don't remember where the definition lies, but outer space, I believe, is outside sort of the primary influence of the Earth's gravity, quite a ways. So what I would consider outer space, I don't know that there's a clean definition of that, but we call it sort of interplanetary, still within the solar system, and then extraplanetary. Low Earth is generally considered, low Earth orbit is generally considered I would say probably on the order of 500 miles above the surface. So, kind of coming back to the CAN presentation that they gave me. So what does Langley do? I mentioned the wind tunnels. The wind tunnels are how we basically simulate air movement across surfaces that make the airplanes fly. I will say that, this was all done long before there was computers, other than the human mind computers, the ones in like the Hidden Figures movie and in that brief period of history where we were in the air and doing things but didn't have electronics that could help us get there. It started with smaller area cross sections. Eventually we started building bigger and bigger wind tunnels to where you could put full fuselages, full aircraft in the tunnel and test it at that level.
Back in the 70s and 80s, when you had when you were sending people to space, and then when it was making a touchdown, and there was a certain geographical area that you would like to land your spacecraft, is it not true that you had to, when that Earth would rotate, it would be count to the second, down to the minute before you make that touchdown so you can land in the right area that you need to land in so that your crew members, the people that was on Earth, could get to your astronauts, to get them back where they need to be.
So there's a ton of planning that has to go into the re-entry. And I was fielding a question about space earlier. One of the things when we're architecting a mission is we've got to have a plan to bring it back safely, whether it's intact or let it burn up when it comes back. If we don't need the hardware back, we prefer that it burns up in the atmosphere and gets to be such small, tiny particles that they're effectively just dust in the ocean. So for the Apollo missions, for example, the space shuttle, we actually are able to time it and land it. The whole spacecraft came back. It was the only vehicle that we've done that with, the space shuttle was. We tried to position the aircraft carrier that would be their rendezvous point, within, I think it was like a 250-mile radius so that they could get there. And then as it's coming in, we pre-position and fine-tune it with helicopters. And they would get closer and they'd be watching for the parachutes. That sounds really easy. It's a really big ocean. So it's amazing that we were able to do that in the 60s and 70s and not lose anybody. And that's actually one of the most dangerous parts of the whole mission. It's easy to think that the liftoff is your big problem, but the reentry is just as bad. So we are now getting back to that point. The president last year said, we're going back to the moon. NASA, you go figure out how to get us back to the moon. And oh, by the way, we want to go to Mars too. So we're going back to the moon for now, but figure out what you need to do on the moon to figure out how to now go to the Mars. So we're back in that mode. Everything has its timing, and the stars, so to speak, have to align to get us there effectively. So one of the things I got to do was develop hand tools for astronauts. And one of the videos I'm fortunate to have is me in a microgravity simulation. If I can find it. This is me about 15 years ago. So what's been cool about what I've gotten to do is I've gotten to work directly side by side with astronauts. I've developed various hand tools for the astronauts to use for very specialized tasks. And so, if you wonder why hammers cost $900, it's, in space or whatever, the media wants to pick up on. It's because you got to do wacky stuff to develop something, to do a very unique task without blowing the space station up. In this particular case, we found a failure mechanism for a valve that if it occurred, if something failed, one component failed, it could pressurize this valve, a closure cavity in a way that instead of being able to push a button to release the valve and decouple two items and replace the item then, if it was failing, instead of a 5-pound pressure, it was going to take something on the order of 1,000 pounds. And it was held on by a little tiny screw about the size of a pencil, a thick pencil lead. And we had to press it without collapsing the backside of the valve and without breaking off the stem. And they had to be able to do it one-handed in a suit that weighs roughly 500 pounds and has gloves the size of an oversized ski jacket, ski glove, with limited visibility because their helmet's up here, they can't crane their neck, and it's in a position that you weren't entirely positive which direction they were going to have to insert themselves from. And so if this is the valve and it would be captured down in a crevice with limited reliability, we had to be able to come on it, soft dock, and let him turn something and press the button while he was hanging on to something else with maybe or maybe not a foot restraint to keep him from floating.
Defense have a satellite program or a space program?
They have many satellite programs and space programs. I think that's actually part of why the president wanted the Space Force,
Yeah.
is maybe to consolidate some of that.
Does that mean we're still going to honor the contract we signed?
So the contract essentially said we were going to put weapons of mass destruction.
That's correct.
Doesn't say anything about other stuff. It doesn't say anything about communication satellites. It doesn't say, so the military space program is more about communication satellites, spy satellites.
Working as closely as you do with NASA and space equipment, whatnot, would you want to go, if you had a chance to go into outer space, would you? I know you got wife and
Yep.
family.
I mean, that would be a big factor. I mean, so I'll be honest, the I was trying to describe to the kids this morning, you know, the challenge with going to Mars. You know, the challenge with going to the moon is challenging. Just communication is seconds of delay between transmit and receive. Going to Mars is minutes. You know, it could take 20 minutes for a signal to go from here to Mars, another 20 minutes for the signal to come back.
I do have another question. Within the language, I guess, goes, are you using a little more AI involved in some of the techniques that you're using?
We're pretty conservative.
You're not using it?
I don't think that we have a lot of AI on board.
Really?
And it depends, you gotta be careful. AI,
Artificial intelligence.
artificial intelligence means it observes, learns, and reacts to a new circumstance that was
Yeah.
not predicted before.
Yeah.
That is really scary to be putting somebody's life on in space. So
But
we are not there
We do
yet.
have,
We test the living crud out of everything in every scenario we can think of with a determinate outcome. In other words, AI doesn't do that. AI goes off the beaten path and uses imagination to solve problems. We do that on the ground, right in that environment. I've blown my schedule, like most of NASA, by 2.
No, not really. Terry, we have enjoyed this so much. And on behalf of Paul Phillips, and a member and a trustee of Pasquotank County Library, and we want to present Terry this special gift of appreciation for enlightening us and showing us what's all going on with Langley and NASA. And also wish Langley a happy 100th birthday. This has been just so enjoyable, has it not been? I think we need to give him a big round of applause.
On behalf of the library, we want to thank all of you for taking time to come out to this very special presentation during World Space Week. So all of you should be commended for the time you've taken to come out to hear what has been presented today. Maya Angelou once said that people will forget what you said. People may forget what you did, but they will never forget how you made them feel. And we're hoping that today we made you feel good by coming out and listening to this presentation, that you all will take something away from this activity today. One of the things that Terry mentioned, he said that he's but a small cog in NASA. Think about that. Here's a man with years and years of education and experience in the aerospace industry, and he's but a small cog. That means that there are many, many other Terrys in NASA. So one of the important things that I think we ought to be taking away from this today is that there's plenty of opportunities for our kids, and we should be taking much of what we learned today back to our kids and back to our various communities, our churches and our civic organizations and whatnot, to let kids know that there are plenty of opportunities in aerospace. So with that, that's the end of our program, and I thank everybody for coming again.